Good morning. Today on Spotlight, meet Neil Allen Barclay, the new president and CEO of one of Detroit's most beloved institutions, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. The museum has had its ups and downs throughout the years, but what's Barclay's vision for making this institution reach its full potential? We'll ask him. And later on this program, the Urban Land Institute's effort to improve diversity in Southeast Michigan real estate. It's Sunday, March the 7th. I'm Chuck Stokes, and this is Spotlight. And welcome to Spotlight, your first time on the show.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It is certainly good having you. All right, before we get into those things that may or may not keep you up at night, let's give the audience a feel, because they don't really know you yet, who you are and where you come from and why Detroit.
Well, let's see. I've been in working in the cultural sector pretty much my entire career. I started out as an attorney, a corporate attorney, and then got back into the arts. I was at the University of Texas, running their Performing Arts Center. I was actually the COO of
in Austin.
In Austin, Texas. Went from there to be the founding president of the August Wilson Center in Pittsburgh. So I built that building and organization.
Build it from the ground up?
From the ground up,
right.
Absolutely.
That's a well-established organization.
It's in their 10th year now, actually, yeah. So, and then most recently was at the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans, and was there for about 7 years. So.
Did you have a favorite among those cities? Those are all great cities, Austin and New Orleans and Pittsburgh. I tend to love every place. And very different cities.
Yeah, favorites, you've got to like the food, in New Orleans, you've got to like the music scene in Austin. And in Detroit, there's all of that food. There's the sports teams. There's there is sort of the cultural tradition of civil rights and activism here. It's fantastic. I love it.
Had you ever spent much time in Detroit before coming now, or was it just a city that you visited from time to time?
No, I spent very little time in Detroit, I'd have to say. I grew up in Chicago, and I have to say that Detroit is very reminiscent. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it reminds me a lot of Chicago.
Yeah. Chicago is just a little bigger.
A little bigger. And I lived in Chicago at a point in my life that now coming to Detroit, is almost nostalgic in a way, if you will, because I grew up in all that snow and ice and cold when I was a young person, and so now coming back to it, it's interesting.
Yeah. What made you want to make the transition from corporate law, which is much different than the fine arts scene, into the world of museums and institutions?
Well, my undergraduate work is in art, so I was a fine arts major. I studied music and visual art and theater primarily as an undergraduate, and did some graduate work even in those subjects, right? So I had always thought that I would be more on the, be in front of the curtain side of the arts. I then decided that wasn't going to be where I would have the most impact, and went to law school, became a corporate lawyer, basically did not enjoy practicing corporate law, and was fortunate enough to be offered the COO position at the University of Texas at Austin, which kind of married the two.
Sure.
Because it was kind of the operations person for that center. And so the legal training came in extremely handy, as did the art training, because I curated, how many seasons? 6, 7 seasons of performing arts events for them.
We're going to take a little break. When we come back, I want to talk about what you view as perhaps your mission during your tenure at the Charles H. Wright Museum. And of course, you've got a little controversial exhibit there. We'll have you weigh in on that as well. We'll be right back with Neil Allen Barclay. Stay with us. Welcome back to Spotlight. We're talking to the new president and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum, right there in the Cultural Center of the city of Detroit. You have a new exhibit. It's been controversial. I think it's the first time that this particular exhibit has been at an African American history museum. It's been at other museums, but not one whose culture is richly steeped in the African American culture. It's called Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. Let's get clear. This decision was made before you came in
Indeed,
and took
yeah.
over as
Indeed,
CEO.
yeah.
So it was already in the works.
Sure. It was already in the works, and actually by the time I got here was actually in Detroit. So
Right.
the crates and all of that had arrived. But you know, it's an exhibit actually that the site of which is Monticello, which was of course Jefferson's plantation, and it attempts to kind of look at well, what it looks at the right is 5 enslaved families, including the family of Sally Hemings, and how they survived and who they actually were as people. And we do that to really highlight, in the context of Jefferson's work around the Declaration of Independence and all men created equal, how sharp that dichotomy actually was. Because it's one thing if you think that the people that those 600 enslaved members of Monticello were, as Jefferson thought at the time, you know, 3/4 human beings, are not quite, you know, the same as the white people of that time. But if you actually look at who they were and their skills and their intelligence and their knowledge, and you put them in that context, and then you introduce Jefferson's concepts, you really see what the paradox is. It really puts that conversation in really sharp relief, you know. And that's what we attempted to do. It's not an exhibit about Jefferson per se, as many people want to characterize it. Jefferson is in the exhibit, obviously, but it's really about these 5 families, who they were, what they did at Monticello, and their descendants, actually, because in recent years, the descendants of Monticello have begun to meet and talk with one another, some 100 descendants, black and white, right, and discovering...
And we should say that at Monticello, Jefferson's life as a statesman is very much dealt with, but also the side that deals with slavery is also a key part
very much so,
of that experience if you go there today.
That's exactly right, yeah. And it's a very much so that they look into, you know, who these people were, who built Monticello, what their work and influence was on that plantation in particular, yeah.
Part of the issue that I understand you have is that you have a group of Detroiters who have been supportive of the African American History Museum here in Detroit for many, many years. They are already upset with the museum because they wanted seats on the board. They didn't get that, and they feel as though the museum is not as Afrocentric as it was, and that it's sort of moving away from that, or they believe it's moving away from that as part of its mission. So they were already upset with the museum, and then when this exhibit came in, they feel as though this is really a slap in the face. Did I characterize that right, and how do you deal with that as the new CEO?
Yeah, I'm fairly new to this conversation, so in terms of characterizing it right or wrong, I'm not really sure I'm the best person to weigh in that, because many of the things you discuss predate me. But I do think that the exhibit is a very Afrocentric one in many ways, in that we take that material and we focus on the people of African descent. It's not focused on Jefferson, as it might have been more so at Monticello, and in fact is at the National Museum. Jefferson is a more prominent image in that. For the right, we were really interested in who these people were and in Sally Hemings, and that's what you see in 3/4, almost the majority of the exhibition in Detroit. So I think that the purpose of the exhibit and the purpose actually of black institutions right now is to really set the record straight, right? To begin to add things to historical narratives that people just don't think about, the dimensions they don't think about as it relates to our experience having lived through it as a people, right? And so the exhibit does attempt to kind of fill in some thoughts, some ideas, some facts about this particular subject matter that people don't think about if they're just thinking about Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, or even just thinking about Monticello.
And isn't that partly the role of any museum, is to share history? And history is sometimes pretty, and sometimes history is ugly, and sometimes it's a real mix of it. But it's about education, and it's about creating a dialogue, and that's part of the role of your museum and others.
It is, and in particular to add to those dialogues a particular perspective of people of African descent, of black people on subject matter, right? And so our role is really to take a issue like this and say, yeah, I understand what most people see in Jefferson and even in Monticello, but have you thought about what a paradox and a dichotomy that was, particularly for people of African descent, to have lived in that place with the person who's getting all of this, you know, knowledge and recognition for all men created equal, and yet to be enslaved people. What was that? And so I think that dialogue explains a lot of how the history of race relationships in the United States, how it has become, you know, such a painful subject, you know, for all of us, right? Because we don't quite understand each other's perspective on the exact same stories, right?
How long will the exhibit be there?
Till June 22nd.
All right, so there's plenty of time for people to be able to get there and see it. When Spotlight returns, Neil Barclay talks about his plans for community engagement. Part of your success in your new role will depend upon that community engagement. Detroit is always known as a town that's not for the faint at heart, and people can be vocal, and people are very proud of the African American history here. Have you had a chance to meet with this sector of the community that has issues with the museum, whatever those issues are, and figure out, okay, how do we come together for the greater good of the museum and our community?
Absolutely, you know, and I applaud the folks who are raising these issues, particularly at this time where I'm beginning my leadership, because I think that, you know, the community dimension of any museum is really critically important, and even more important with Black museums, right? That they actually speak to and connect the community's perspective on these issues in the work that they do, that they reflect that, right? So, you know, my practice prior to coming here has been to have a community advisory committee of some kind. So I do plan on very quickly impaneling that group, which I hope involves a lot of the folks who are critical of this particular exhibit, to help us as we design the exhibits coming up, to really give it a Detroit perspective on the material that we might do. I also do know that there will be some additional members of the community added to the board of directors. There aren't a lot of open spots at this moment, not kicking some people off, you know, so, but we do hope to have some additional members join the board as well. I think that the right has done an extremely good job with this material. What we didn't do is involve the community in the good job that we ended up doing, right? And I think they would have had more ownership on it had they been involved in that process from the beginning.
Final question, but perhaps the most important one. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what's your mission for the museum? How do you get it on strong financial footing, and also make sure that it's a museum in which people support it financially, but also from a cultural standpoint?
Right. So, you know, Black museums in the United States are chronically under-resourced. So one of the things that I have to do in the next 5 years is find the resources and right-size the institution to the resources that are available to it, and it can be available on a sustaining basis, right? So identifying donors, foundations, corporations, whatever, who are really able to get the museum to the place to where the resources that they need to run a 120,000 square foot facility, right, are actually there. Because for years now, the right has been undercapitalized. It does not have the kinds of funds that would be required, in my experience, to run an organization, a building of that size. I want to figure out how Detroit's history and culture can become the center of a national and international dialogue about the role of African Americans in the evolution of what we consider the American ideal. The things that people outside of the United States think are American are actually African American in origin, right? And in Detroit, we are also at the sort of the the folks who began many of those traditions of civil disobedience, of critical dialogue around issues of importance to African Americans. And, you know, whether it's electronic music or Aretha Franklin or Motown, we've also been, Detroit has been instrumental in that, the creation of that. And so I want people to understand that about the Detroit and about Wright, the Wright Museum, that, you know, we're talking about a culture that really created a lot of what we understand about African Americans, about America, and about the world at large.
Well, you're right that it's a special town, it's a special museum and a special place, one that is held in great esteem in this community and a key part of this community, because so many different events take place there. And when you mention the Wright Museum, everybody knows what you're talking about. Totally. So we wish you the best of luck in your tenure there, and know that you have a platform here anytime you feel you need to come in and talk about some new and exciting things that you're doing there.
There'll be many on tap, so I'll definitely come back and visit with you.
All right, we look forward to it.
It's a pleasure, absolutely. Thank you.
It's our pleasure having you on Spotlight. And we would be remiss today if we didn't send our condolences to the family of Dr. Roberta Hughes Wright, who passed away last week at the wonderful age of 96 years young. Like her husband, whose name is on this museum, she was a powerful trailblazer in her very own right. She will indeed be missed. And coming up, Jill Ferrari of Shelbourne Development, Derek Scott of the East Jefferson Development Corporation, and Dina Fox of Rossetti Real Estate. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Spotlight. We're sort of changing topics here and talking about something that everybody's talking about in Detroit specifically and Southeast Michigan, and that is real estate and all the different changes that you see and all the cranes that you see going up in the ground and all the new buildings. And some people that are involved in some of that are with me today on Spotlight. Welcome. Good having all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Let me start with you, Jill Ferrari. The Urban Land Institute, what is that? And you're specifically tied into trying to increase diversity in real estate.
Yes, Urban Land Institute is a global organization with district councils in hundreds of countries around the world.
Okay.
The Michigan District Council is what we participate in. It is statewide. We have programming across the state, including the Upper Peninsula. The organization is dedicated to the sustainable use of land, and land use professionals from service providers, environmental professionals, to developers like myself are members of the organization. And historically, real estate has been predominantly Caucasian members, white male members. And over the last 10 years in particular, this district council has made a concerted effort to increase diversity, the inclusion of female voice in urban land and sustainable urban land, and most recently, persons of color. You know, we feel that sustainable communities cannot be designed by a group of professionals that's not diverse.
How long have the two of you been involved in real estate?
For me, it's been 15 years now, so shortly before becoming an adult, I got engaged at a very young age.
Okay, yeah, we know you have 6 children, so you haven't just been doing real estate, you've been raising a family too as well, which is certainly wonderful. Dina, how about yourself?
So for me, I've been in the architecture field for about 13 years now, but I actually worked with architects and designers for about another 7 years before that. So on the design side of the industry for about 20 years.
All right. What kind of changes, and I want all of you to weigh in on this, what kind of changes have you seen in the Southeast Michigan market, particularly maybe over the last 5 years, coming out of the bankruptcy? I mean, every time I roll down to downtown or midtown, I'm seeing something new, either an old building getting refurbished or a new building going up.
That's right. Both of those things have been happening I think with a pace of greater momentum over the last couple of years, which I think we're all very happy to see. And it's beginning to spread beyond simply the core areas of downtown and midtown out into other parts of the city as well. Of course, there have also been smaller scale development happening as well across the city. I think in terms of looking at changes to how development is done along the lines of what Jill had mentioned earlier, we do want to make sure that we're doing all that we can so that all voices are represented.
Open up those doors.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Derek, do you feel like those barriers are coming down, and what remains to be done?
One of the things that we've been trying to be very critical about doing is making sure that as development happens, it is inclusive, and that people that have been here for a while, Detroit residents, have an opportunity to participate in the development that's happening. So you have programs like ULI, the inclusionary program, that's making sure that there's a seat at the table for folks that look much like me to be able to participate in the development that they see happening downtown. And now it gives us a sense that that can happen in their neighborhoods as well.
And certainly something that we hear politicians and city leaders talk a lot about is that as Detroit comes back, we want it to come back for everybody. Right. Jill, the most popular programs that the Urban Land Institute, the Michigan chapter, what are they?
In 2013, we launched the Women's Leadership Initiative that's specifically designed to promote female members, their networks, their role in leadership positions, and most recently through that initiative, we launched the Build Up Breakfast. It's a quarterly event. It provides a local opportunity to network, but also statewide. So there's 7 different locations statewide where women have met, and they have a kind of an opportunity to build their network locally, but also it's our effort to really connect these women statewide because we face similar issues in the industry.
Part of it's networking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you get
Strong
to know
component.
each other over breakfast or lunch or something of that nature, there's a good chance that those barriers start to come down, and next thing you know, you're maybe doing business with each other.
We have women who participate who are on the professional services side, whether it's architecture, engineering, construction, but also on the municipal side, the policy side. And so there's really a kind of an intersection of all of the interests that are needed to bring about success on these development projects.
Derek, do you have a favorite program out of all this?
So I think I like the Pathways program, but I also like a program that Dina's working with, which is the ARC Prep program, which is really encouraging to me because I started what was the original version of that, which is the ARC Start program at the University of Michigan, which engages minority students here in the city of Detroit in the field of architecture and gets them engaged around exposing them to the industry in general. And so I think capturing youth and high school students early enough in the process to show them that this is an option, I think that's vital to making sure that there's diversity representation, because that was something that I didn't have as a high school student. I kind of stumbled my way into this. I thought I was going to be an architect, and really what I wanted to do was develop.
Right.
And so I kind of found my way to that. But I think exposure is key, and the more we can introduce what we do earlier to youth, it makes the difference with exposing folks to the industry.
I commend all 3 of you for doing what you're doing, opening up the doors for diversity in real estate. You guys stick around. We're going to continue this conversation exclusively on WXYZ.com. I have a lot more questions, and I know they have a lot more answers for me. I'm Chuck Stokes. We'll be back next week with more newsmakers in the spotlight. We hope you have a great week.